And good Sunday morning to you. Welcome to Invest Northwest. I'm Sean Owsley. Glad you're starting your day with us once again this morning. We are focusing on a regional company called Fatbeam. What does this company deliver? How? And what about this business model sets it up for the long term? Gregory Green, Greg, is here with us this morning. Has over 20 years of senior management experience in telecommunications sector. Greg, thanks for being here on the program.
Thanks for having me.
I'm going to give him your resume real quick. You've worked for Nextlink, Avista, 180 Communications, and now you are the co-founder of Fatbeam.
Correct.
Talk about that progression for you and why Fatbeam is positioned to succeed in the region and beyond.
Originally, I got involved in the telecommunications space when we went through deregulation in the '96 Telecom Act, and we formed Nextlink at the time and other companies after, which competed essentially with the phone companies. And Fatbeam is a provider of fiber optic services, broadband. So we essentially build infrastructure that we deliver to large ISPs, phone companies, carriers, hospitals, and education space, and then they turn that into a capacity type of broadband that they use for either for their business or they used to deliver it to their customers.
And you're a Washington-based company?
Correct. We're a Washington corporation. We're headquartered in Post Falls, Idaho.
Okay, and obviously you're serving the entire inland Northwest region. And let's talk about your product specifically. If you can, walk us through what it is you provide, how you provide it.
Absolutely. We build fiber optic networks. We have networks in Yakima, Centralia, Medical Lake, Post Falls, Coeur d'Alene, Liberty Lake, and we build high capacity fiber optic networks, and we take those networks and we lease them to large carriers like XO Communications, even CenturyLink and other competitors, and also to ISPs. Then we'll take those products and we'll just deliver an amount of bandwidth for their customers so that they can turn those into solutions for high definition video. They can turn that into a product or a retail product like broadband internet or voice telecommunication services.
How is this? You and I did a story a long time ago here. It has been a while when we saw each other. We were like, hey, I remember you. And talk about the difference, though, from that point in time when we did that story, which I believe was probably early 2000s to now, a decade later. It seems like it has just continued exponentially changed the industry that you're working in.
Yeah, absolutely. Back in the day that you and I talked, 5-10 years ago, we were building out Spokane, New York, Seattle, bigger markets than the Nextlink days. What we're doing now is we're building out what I would call the tertiary markets, the markets that's essentially been sort of void of fiber. Yakima, Centralia, Coeur d'Alene, North Idaho, Post Falls as an example. So we're going down into the third and fourth tier markets that sort of got missed by the economic impact of, sort of the telecom meltdown back in the late 90s or early 2000. So now we're going back and revisiting those markets. And what's unique about Fatbeam is we deliver a product. Initially, we deliver that product to a school district. So in the case of Yakima, we built 24 miles of fiber to 20 plus schools, and they took that fiber and they delivered that and they built 1,400 cameras. High definition cameras. So they needed a large amount of capacity. And in our particular case, what's unique is that we have an anchor tenant in that school district. So once we build a school district, we build it out for that community so that others can enjoy it as well and have the benefit of economic development.
There was a news release released by your company last week, dated October 26th, where you announced fiber contracts with Coeur d'Alene and Post Falls school districts. Talk about that and why that's a win for your company.
Well, it's really exciting. We have a sister company called Adnetics, and Adnetics is owned by my partner. And essentially, you can imagine within four walls of a building, Adnetics provides all the technology solutions. My partner and I got together about 2 years ago, and he said, if I could ever get fiber between schools. So Coeur d'Alene is a great example. They did not have fiber capacity and the bandwidth that they were looking for, dark fiber, and we built dark fiber to these schools in Coeur d'Alene. And then they took that fiber, they lit it, and then essentially what they did is they turned it into a vehicle so they could do distance learning and other sorts of forms of education. And with that anchor tenant then, we then connected Post Falls to that network, and then ultimately we connected those two locations to Liberty Lake, which has a large data center, to your point.
All right, talk about lit fiber versus dark fiber. You just mentioned it.
Sure.
If you can, explain the difference.
Sure. Lit fiber is a finished product. Essentially, we're providing a specific amount of capacity to you. Dark fiber is a product that's very attractive for healthcare or education or even large carriers because they can determine the amount of bandwidth that they get. So they're leasing an amount of capacity from us. And it's a little like where you go, you have your internet at home. Every time you want more bandwidth, you turn the spigot up, the carrier charges you more.
Right.
In our particular case, if you lease dark fiber, then you're in control of that bandwidth because it's based on the electronics that you put on each end.
Okay, I know I went to your website before we did this interview and looked at the coverage map, the deployment areas, the metro deployment, and what you're working on right now. Explain today where you're at, where you're going.
Okay. Today we're in the Pacific Northwest. We have about just shy of 100 miles of fiber in Yakima, Sunnyside, Centralia, North Idaho. Once those networks were established by basically signing contracts with the school districts, we then have gone out and leased capacity to others in the community. We use it as an economic development tool, but we're also looking at markets in Oregon and possibly even California at some point if we get into that market space.
A quote of yours that I read, it said, well, at Fatbeam you intend to build a growth engine that maintains financial responsibility. Obviously the ultimate goal of any business.
That's true.
Greg, if you can, I would love your answer on this, as I have worked closely with a lot of business leaders. Some of the smaller businesses have made it, some have not. Obviously the tough economic times we've just gone through. Why is Fatbeam positioned different? Everybody can have a great idea,
sure,
but executing it and then sustaining the business model doesn't always happen. Why is your company different?
Our company is unique in the sense that we are at the very, if you will, top of the food chain, in the sense that everyone wants what we have, number one. There's a great demand. Yeah. At the end of the day, it does not get any better than fiber in the telecommunications space. Secondly, when we go into a market, we're going into a market that we've already signed a long-term contract. Right. Typically somewhere between 5 to 10 years is the length of our contract. So much like someone in construction that builds a strip mall, they have that anchor tenant. So once we have that anchor tenant in a given market, that essentially funds our business model for that market, and then any additional revenue that we create is, it goes to the bottom line.
Gives you stability then,
absolutely,
long term.
Absolutely.
If you can, talk about the product specifically, and we talked about how things have changed so swiftly over the last decade. How do you stay ahead of that curve and make sure you have the most cutting edge product delivered to your customers every day?
That's a tough one. You're always trying. We'd like to stay in front of the forefront, but we don't really like to be first.
Let somebody else test it out.
Exactly.
Okay.
Right.
All right.
So we have great partners in Cisco. We have great partners at NetX, and we have other carriers. And the nice thing about, I mentioned carriers like the AT&Ts or the cell companies that lease capacity on our networks to their cell towers. These folks are also sort of trying to be out there and trend and try to figure out what type of capacity and technology is the latest. So actually our partners do a really good job of helping us determine what that is. But at the end of the day, owning that fiber is an asset that everybody wants.
I remember as we look at some of the construction that your company's involved with, being a child of the 80s, I remember Atari and Space Invaders and Intellivision, and that just seems so archaic for all of the technology that we see today. 10 years, 20 years from now, I don't think we can imagine what it's really going to be like and how it's going to impact our daily lives. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. The technology that comes out, look at your cell phone. What has changed over the cell phone in the last number of years?
You used to have the big brick phone, and now you have a smartphone that basically does it all for you.
You had one of those, right? $2,500 this big.
I did not have one of those, but I've seen them. But the technology, bottom line, you'd think you just try and stay ahead of it, but make sure it's tested out, stable, get these contracts. So that's the kind of the bottom line of what your focus is right now.
Absolutely. We have something that we do in our organization that's we don't build anything without a contract signed and in front of us. So that financial responsibility that we have, that really helps our business on the bottom line. So everything we do is called success-based. So if you're interested in fiber for your cell towers, or you're interested in fiber for your building, once we have a contract, we'll start the construction of that.
How many employees for your company? Very
small today. We have 3 employees, including myself, and we have a couple of contractors that we work with closely. So we look like we're about 5, but that's really it. Pretty simple.
Any chance of adding jobs down the line?
Absolutely, absolutely.
What time frame?
I think that as we continue to grow on the east side of the state, there's some other markets that we're looking at over there. There was an acquisition that we were looking at. We kind of placed that on the table for now. But I would say it's very fair to say in the next couple of years we'll probably have 20 employees.
Okay.
Yeah.
Final question for you this morning, and I like to ask the local business owners, how they feel about the regional economy right now, the overall environment. What are you seeing and hearing in your day-to-day operations?
You know, I first of all, I feel for people that are out of work. You just hear just terrible stories about folks that are just really struggling, professional folks like us. So I think we're very fortunate. But I will also say that I think we're a little isolated. We've always been that way. And so on one hand, why the folks in the economic development world want to see Spokane or the Inland Northwest grow faster, I think we benefit from being a little isolated. So in our case, I don't think maybe that economy has hit us as hard as it's hit others. But it's still tough out there. But I think that you're starting to see some growth out there with companies and hiring.
Obviously, the healthcare industry here and all the hospitals, medical, and having Fairchild here helps kind of buffer it a little bit for us.
Exactly.
All right, Greg, thanks for being here on the program
Thanks for
sharing
having
your story.
me.
Appreciate seeing you again. We're going to take a break. You're watching Invest Northwest. We're back in a minute.